We welcome you to this first webinar that we have for you today. This webinar is intended and organized by the Department of Leadership for Learning and Innovation within the Faculty of Education. And we're working in collaboration with the Center for Educational Neuroscience at University College London and the Educational Neuroscience Hub Europe. Our intention is to promote and disseminate ways in which educational neuroscience can inform classroom instruction. And for this first initiative, we have organized two webinars, one which will be held today, and our presenter will be Professor Michael Thomas, and our second webinar next week will be presented by Andrew Tolmie. Both webinars will discuss educational neuroscience and our understanding of educational neuroscience and its potential application to understand and improve student learning. I will just take you through how we're going to structure this webinar. So what we will have is, following my introduction, we'll ask Erica to give us some brief insights into why educational neuroscience is important today. Then we'll have Michelle, who will introduce our speaker and give us a brief introduction about the team that Professor Michael Thomas will discuss. Then Professor Michael Thomas will give his presentation, about 45 to 50 minutes presentation, following which we'll go into some questions and discussion around the topic. We kindly ask you to put any questions in the chat. We will obviously then take up your questions and try to answer them during the discussion. We suggest that you switch off your cameras during Professor Michael Thomas' presentation, but then switch it on again for the questions and discussion part. I think what I can add is that this is also part of an initiative that we will then follow up with our Connect to Learning series between October and December of this year, where we will then try to follow up on education neuroscience and engage practitioners in our series of webinars. So I think I leave the word to Erica.
Thank you, James. First, I would like to thank Professor Michael Thomas for accepting our invitation today to give an overview of education neuroscience, which is a very intriguing and interesting topic. Next week, we're going to be having Professor Andy Tolmie talking about ways on how education and neuroscience can inform classroom interventions through maths and science. As James mentioned, this was organized in collaboration with the Center of Education Neuroscience, University College London and Birkbeck, and the Education Neuroscience Hub Malta. The Education Neuroscience Hub Malta is an independent local initiative with the aim of creating more awareness locally amongst faculty members, educators, policymakers, parents, and other professionals within the educational field on this innovative and pioneering topic. The aim is to create more awareness and a better understanding of the development of the brain within the context of teaching and learning. And it also aims to create, which I feel is really important, a bridge, a common language between science researchers and practitioners in the classrooms, and also another important stakeholder, parents, enhancing these evidence-based strategies. As we are aware, over the past few decades, we have experienced a revolution in brain studies, gaining a better understanding of the human complex behavior. And with this knowledge, I believe we can empower teachers and parents to reach out to the children in a holistic way, behaviorally, emotionally, cognitively, and socially as well, which all affect their learning. So the Education Neuroscience Hub will be organizing seminars, webinars, and talks, both independently and also together in conjunction with the University of Malta, Faculty of Education, and also with the Center of Education and Neuroscience, in order to promote ways in which education neuroscience can inform classroom instruction or daily strategies that teachers and parents can use. So I'll be putting the link of the Facebook page of the Education Neuroscience Hub in the chat, and you can follow it to know about our talks and seminars, our updates on a daily basis. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Michelle, on to you.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, James, for introducing this webinar. So basically, I'm going to briefly introduce the nature of the talk of Professor Thomas, who will explain to us how educational neuroscience is an interdisciplinary research field that seeks to translate research findings on neural mechanisms of learning to educational practice and policy, and also to understand the effects of education on the brain. Neuroscience and education can interact directly by virtue of considering the brain as a biological organ that needs to be in the optimal condition to learn, what we refer to as brain health in layman terms, or indirectly as neuroscience shapes psychological theory and psychology influences education. He will also use his talk to trace the origins of educational neuroscience, its main areas of research activity, and the principal challenges it faces as a translational field. Translational field, sorry, a lot of complex words there, which I hope I would be able to become more familiar to during the talk. So now, without much further ado, I think I'm going to pass on the floor to Professor Thomas so that he can introduce his speech.
Super. Thanks so much, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today. So let me just share my screen. Is everyone able to see that? See that, guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Super. Okay, so yeah, I've chatted with Andy Tomey and we've coordinated. So this week's seminar is intended to give you an overview of educational neuroscience. And I guess my target audience is I'm imagining a busy teacher in the classroom who's kind of interested in this, how the brain works, and neuroscience, and that's kind of interesting, but is really wondering how much is the teacher supposed to know about neuroscience, and how exactly is that going to influence classroom practice? And do you really want these neuroscientists, which I kind of imagine in white coats, standing next to brain scanners? Do you really want them telling you how to teach? What do they really know about teaching? So that's the kind of audience that I'm imagining out there. Obviously, there'll be different people out there. I'll be interested to see your questions at the end. Okay, so let's get going. This is the structure of the talk, so you can get a sense of where we are as we go along. I'm going to start by trying to contextualize educational neuroscience, and the main point there is going to be that, like, you know, neuroscience is really only a little part of a massive cultural and social endeavor that is education. So we need to view the neuroscience contribution in context, and that context is going to be part of a broader evidence-based approach to education. So I'm going to set that broad context, and then I'm going to jump into a little bit into, you know, why educational neuroscience, what is it, what is its history, and we'll have a look at some things that can go wrong in trying to think about how the brain works, and work with educators to think how that might be useful in the classroom, but also look at some of the benefits, potential benefits, maybe I'd say at this stage, because educational neuroscience is at the beginning of a long road. Towards the end, that's the tough bit. We're going to try and figure out how the brain works, as much as we know that, and perhaps more importantly, what the educators need to know about that, that's going to inform their practice. And that'll bring us to the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And I know Erica has already sent me a couple of potential questions, which look really scary. Okay. So let's start by contextualizing educational neuroscience. And this is a diagram we put together a couple of years ago, which brings together two different theoretical frameworks. One of them is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, and another one is Susan Mitchell's behavioral change framework. And the main message of this diagram is to think that there are nested constraints on influencing educational outcomes. So all of these are interacting with each other in constraining or promoting how well any given individual is going to succeed in education. So right in the middle, okay, there we have learning outcomes, and surrounding that we have child level factors, things like ability, health, attention and motivation, and nutrition. But the individual, the child, sits within a school where there are factors that can promote or be barriers to learning outcomes, things like school policy, teacher materials, the teacher skill set, classroom environment. And of course, schools sit within society, so there are social factors, family factors, the kind of technological environment we exist in now, and then there are government factors, so aspects about what is the national curriculum, what does the government think that children should be learning in the classroom, how much money does the government have to spend on education, and what are the mechanisms of policy to influence all these outcomes. So if I'm talking about educational neuroscience and I'm talking about how the brain works, yeah, for sure, from my perspective, all learning, which is, you know, a change in behavioral abilities, has to be driven by the brain, but that's just one small component of what we're talking about. And there are many other constraints that are going to be influencing educational outcomes. So in fact, before I talk about the brain, I want to spend a little bit more time perhaps in the outer ring here, the government factors, and I will talk mainly about the UK perspective at the moment, but also a little bit internationally. So in the UK, we have for perhaps about a decade had a policy move towards viewing teaching as a kind of apprentice that is much more about learning on the job, with relatively restricted aspects of theory. And the pendulum has begun to swing back in the opposite direction with the UK government's publication of the early career framework. So this is a laying out of the kind of skills, competencies and knowledge that teachers should have early on in their training. So you can see in the contents of that early career framework, there's high expectations, how pupils learn, subject and curriculum, classroom practice, adaptive teaching, assessment, managing behavior, and professional behaviors. And the bit I want to pull out for you here is the section on how pupils learn. And this actually talks quite a lot about the learning sciences, cognitive science in particular, makes reference to things like working memory, long-term memory, attention, and so forth. So this is just an indication that within the UK, there is a move towards specifying more theoretical aspects of teacher training, and indeed of appealing to the evidence base, our current understanding in the learning sciences. So this is another document, the Education Inspection Framework. It's an organization in the UK that assesses the quality of education in the various schools. And this is a document which, again, it's like 2019, covers the evidence base, the research out there that supports the appeal to the learning sciences. And so in this box in the bottom right-hand corner, I've just pulled out the kind of things that this document talks about with regard to the learning sciences. Things like spaced or distributed practice being better than mass practice, interleaving content, retrieval practice, elaboration, dual coding, that's presenting information in two modalities at once, something called cognitive load theory. I've put that in scare quotes because I don't want you to think that that's actually a cognitive theory. It's quite a popular instructional set of guidelines at the moment. But it is influential in UK education circles, and something called the expert reversal effect, that the more expert individuals become, there's a difference in the way they should learn. So part of this is just to say that there's this shift towards the learning sciences and theory going into teacher education, and an appeal to a research evidence base. And indeed, in the UK, some years ago, there was a decision by the Department for Education to set up a dedicated institution to build the evidence base of what works. So this is the Education Endowment Foundation, and they produce lots of materials. So they basically commission randomized controlled trials to assess the effectiveness, both in terms of learning outcomes, but also cost effectiveness of various sorts of intervention. Andy, next week we'll talk about a trial that we've been running out of the Center for Educational Neuroscience. And this involves taking a learning technique, an activity in the classroom, and running a randomized control trial on around 6,000 children around the country. So large scale trials. And you can see here the kind of summaries they produce on this plot here, showing what is the cost per pupil of various kind of techniques, such as mentoring, one-to-one tuition, feedback, and so forth. And what is the effect size? So ideally, you want something with a very big effect size on learning outcomes that is a very cheap cost per pupil. And here's a kind of blown up version of a web-based resource that the Education Endowment Foundation produces, called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. And you can see the various different methods, so collaborative learning there. You can see that the cost, that's pretty cheap. There's good evidence of that it works. And then there's an actual effect size. So how many months of learning advance would you get? So that's in the UK framework. What I'm showing you here is another report, which is just come out, very large document, Reimagining Education, which comes out of a UNESCO center, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. And again, this is reimagining education, appealing to the international science and evidence-based education assessment. So part of this kind of global move to thinking about, can we put education on a more evidence-based approach, a science of learning approach. And you'll see there are different trends emerging here. Every learner learns differently, a whole brain learner-centric approach. So interesting for me that the brain is appearing in there. I like that. The importance of context, of learner agency. And this is a slightly new one for me, stressing something called potentiality instead of meritocracy. So I take that to be, it's not how well you do overall, or not just how well you do overall, but how well you are doing against your own potential. And down at the bottom, you'll see another key theme there is multidisciplinary approaches, multidisciplinary dialogue, which is part of what educational neuroscience is about. Okay, so this is a kind of broader context, global and national for us in the UK, of an evidence-based approach to education. I'm going to say there are some tensions in that approach. So one of those is the approach you want to take if you're working out whether something works or not, how it works, is slightly different to making it work. So if you're discovering how something works, you want to run these big randomized control trials where you just vary one thing that you think is important and you hold everything else constant, and you have kind of control conditions and so forth. And that tells you, how does it work? Does it work at all? But if you want positive outcomes for a given child, really you just want to throw everything at that child that you think might possibly work to get the biggest effect size at the end, because you want a good outcome for that child. If you do that, it's going to be very hard to know what produced that outcome, right? So generally, we want great educational outcomes for our kids, but there's a slight tension in that approach versus we need to do things more systematically to see what works. And then there's a tension around prescriptive national policies. Does a strong evidence base mean that the government tells teachers what they should be doing? Or do we really want to promote teacher autonomy? Should the teacher be in charge in the classroom? We're just giving them more tools that they can select to use, thinking about what's appropriate for their children, given the stage they're at in the context of their culture and society. And then there's this tension around, if you're appealing to an evidence base, then you're getting involved with academics doing research trials, and there is quite a lot of academic debate. You sit any two academics in a room, they'll have some disagreement about something or other. That's not necessarily helpful to policymakers where they want a kind of consensus about where the field is now. And I have been in situations where policymakers, government ministers have been completely switched off by the research base because academics stand up and have a row in front of the policymakers. And the policymakers say, you guys just don't know what you're talking about yet. Come back to me when you've decided how things work. But I think, nevertheless, despite that tension or these sets of tensions, there is common ground, and it's about understanding how learning works. Learning isn't everything in education, but I'm going to say it's an important part. Okay, so let's move on to educational neuroscience to focus now in the center of those rings, the individual, the mechanisms of learning. Educational neuroscience is not the only name for it. Sometimes it's called neuroeducation. Sometimes in the US, it's called mind, brain, and education. I'm not sure educational neuroscience is the right name for it, but I'm not sure we know the right name for it. Education, learning, and the brain. Maybe that's a better name for it. Educational neuroscience makes it sound like it's neuroscience first and then education second. But that's not really our goal. The goal of this field is to take insights from understanding neural mechanisms of learning and to see how those might be useful in the classroom. So it's inherently translational. It's inherently about a dialogue between basic research and practitioners. And it is a big challenge. We're going to see that there's some debate about it. Can principles of how the brain works, of people, measuring the activity, electrical activity in a single neuron or a brain area, can that really tell you how to build a lesson plan in the classroom? I'm going to say, it's a long route, but it can be helpful. So the new science of learning really got going in the late 1990s and was driven by technological advances in neuroscience. And mainly this was driven by brain imaging techniques. So prior to that, figuring out how the brain worked was a lot about, basic biology of individual cells and neurons, animal models and so forth. But then looking at adults who'd had different patterns of brain damage and seeing how from that, what kind of deficits did they have with different parts of damage to the brain. But in the 1990s, with the brain imaging techniques, we could for the first time begin to see in vivo, in a regular behaving person, information about what parts of their brain were working harder and what the electrical activity was and what the oxygen consumption was in different brain areas. And this has helped us piece together, along with those other techniques, the basic biology, the animal models, some better understanding of the principles of function of the brain. So this feeds then into the new science of learning, applying those neuroscience principles to the kind of skills and abilities relevant to what children are learning in the classroom, and indeed adults learning throughout their lifespan. So it's the interaction between neuroscience and education, but a lot of that is brokered through psychology. So fundamentally, psychology is the main participant in a dialogue of education in theories of learning, but neuroscience is shaping or changing our theories about how learning works within psychology. I've added in machine learning there. That's another contributor to the new science of learning. And I'll give you an example about how that plays in a minute. But the machine learning is this kind of wider understanding about how does learning work in principle? And are there different ways learning could work than how the brain does it? So the Center for Educational Neuroscience was set up in 2008. And it's a cross-institution research center that brought together the then expertise in neuroscience at University College London, in education at the Institute of Education, and in Birkbeck, which focuses on child development, particularly in the Center for Brain and Cognitive Development. So the idea was to bring together expertise from different areas, put people in the same room, establish the dialogue, and begin to think about how we could use basic neuroscience to address the kinds of challenges that teachers are facing in the classroom. These are some examples of the sorts of projects that we're doing. This isn't everything we're doing, but it gives a sense of the range. So Andy will be talking to you next week about one of our long-running projects looking at primary age science and maths learning, particular sort of 8 to 10-year-olds, and focusing particularly on how they acquire concepts that either are inconsistent in mathematics or are counterintuitive in science. So just to whet your appetite, with young children, you spend a lot of time getting them, teaching them to learn to count. And for instance, that 5 is bigger than 4, and there's a number line and so forth. And then you give them fractions where it turns out a fifth is smaller than a quarter. And then you teach them negative numbers where -5 is smaller than -4. So how is the child supposed to acquire those kind of concepts? At some point, I'm muted then. Which part did you miss?
Michael, we heard you all the way, so you can continue going on.
Fantastic. I got a sign saying I was muted. All right. So, yeah, I was talking about science. Young children grow up playing football on flat football pitches. And then all of a sudden, about age 6, someone's telling them that the world is round. And they're supposed to learn that for their science class, but it shouldn't change the way they play football, unless they're sort of trying to bend it like Beckham, I suppose. So Andy's going to tell you all about that, what the neuroscience of that, and how you start with a challenge that in the classroom that children find it difficult to learn these concepts, and somehow looking at how the brain does that and ending up with some set of activities that is actually useful for teachers, but we can demonstrate has some benefit that would improve how they do on maths and science tests. So that's been a long-running project. That's the one where we've been running randomized control trials, which have just, for those who like that kind of thing, are moving from an efficacy trial into an effectiveness trial at this stage. So that's looking at primary age learning. Let's move to teenage. We have again, a long-running project in collaboration with Imperial College London, having a look at executive function skills. So part of kind of cognitive control, working memory, decision-making, these kind of skills, how they're developing in teenagers, and particularly comparing that to the current ecology of technology use. This project initially started off with a concern, this was maybe 10 years ago, that mobile phones were designed, they were safety tested against adults and animal models. And then all of a sudden, who's using them the most? It's the teenagers, the adolescents. Are they safe? We know the teenage brain is still developing. Is it good to be holding a radio emitter right next to a developing brain? Particularly, we know across the teenage years, executive function skills are still developing, and some aspects of language skills as well. So this study was originally conceived of as kind of looking at possible negative health effects of mobile phones. But those kind of large-scale studies take some time to get going. And by the time we actually started the trial, 2 things had happened. Teenagers stopped holding phones against their head. Just don't do it. It's all down here, right? And actually we went from 3G to 5G, so the radio frequency emissions are somewhat different, and phones changed to become smart, and kids started using their devices to do all sorts of activities which may possibly have a benefit on cognition. So we've been following a group of teenagers, actually 6,000 to 7,000 teenagers, looking at their technology use, the development of their executive function skills, latterly looking at mental health aspects around social media. And the most recent thing we've been doing is, well, twofold actually, looking at how COVID has affected these individuals. And also now we've got their sort of exam results, we can actually look at the educational outcomes and how some of their earlier cognitive skills and the technology use and health behaviors are predicting their educational outcomes. So that's looking at a kind of teenage age bracket. Up in the top left here, we got a sort of lifespan. We're involved in a project having a look at adult literacy programs in low-income countries. And this is a project in collaboration with UNESCO and with the World Bank, and was really driven by an understanding that in a lot of low-income countries, there is a problem with children not learning to read as children. In some cases, the education systems are improving, but they're not addressing the big cohort of adults who never learn to read. In many cases, these are women in societies that don't prioritize education for girls. So you have this cohort of often poor adults who haven't learned to read. And there are adult literacy programs to try and address that, to try and help these individuals acquire a skill that can open up new employment avenues for them. But these adult literacy programs are really quite ineffective in terms of the number of individuals who achieve some kind of functional literacy by the end of it. And the World Bank, UNESCO are interested in whether there's a neuroscience principle for that. Is there something different about the adult brain that makes learning to read a lot harder? Is it less plastic, or do we need to teach adults somehow in a different kind of way to kids? So we have been involved in writing reports, and at the moment, actually, we're evaluating, trying to feed into improving an adult literacy program in Malawi, trying to embed best principles of teaching reading, teaching literacy, but also to understand that, embed that in a kind of cultural context, and to think about the everyday lives of those individuals. For instance, many women are also running a home household. We know, finger in the wind, it takes kids about 2,000 hours of practice to learn to read. If you put an adult in an adult literacy program for about 6 months, they're only going to do about 10% of that. So they need another 90% of the time to learn, to do the practice to achieve reading fluency. And how can we support that kind of practice at home to get the kind of automaticity that you need in reading? So that's a kind of lifespan approach. Another thing we've been doing is more sort of physical, basic, looking at the classroom, again, the kind of school context in our nested constraints. And we've had a couple of PhD students working on the role of the classroom environment, and particularly thinking about noise, thinking about visual clutter in the classroom, auditory noise. To what extent are these distracting? We know that young kids are least able, with their attentional skills, to screen out distracting information. But if you go into a early years classroom, you'll find all the walls covered with fantastic amounts of information, right? Potentially super distracting. We know in teenagers, they're much better able to have selective attention, to screen out distracting information. You go into their classrooms, the walls are all bare. So somehow it feels like those two things are the wrong way around. So we're doing a set of research around the classroom environment. Some of that links to the urban environment as well, and having a look at air pollution as well as noise distractions in the classroom. So that gives a sense of the range. We're looking at different age groups. We're looking at different kind of cultural and kind of school contexts of learning. Fortunately, we're still in a climate where policymakers are receptive and interested in the contribution of neuroscience. They can ask quite hard questions. So this was an example of a grilling I had from a UK government committee, Education Committee and Work and Pensions Committee. And they were asking me, this question they asked me, can I ask specifically with Professor Thomas, and perhaps broadening out, I want to ask you if you could explain to us what is the practical policy value of the work that's being done in neuroscience and how that influences the understanding of young children's life chances. Obviously, that will be another talk to talk about that. That was the first question that had that session kicked off. I think there is a lot of interesting stuff to say about that. And part of what I said about that is...
Sorry, could you say...
Part of what I said about that was that has been a policy focus on the early years, but increasingly we're seeing the importance of adolescence. Early years generates potential in children, but really we need adolescence to realize that potential. Okay, so I've given you told you what educational neuroscience is, told you a little bit about our research center and what we're up to, and the kind of policy context, both nationally and internationally, in which that fits. I want to take a step back now and go down into a little bit more into the detail about neuroscience and why neuroscience in particular will be relevant and not just psychology. So do teachers need to know about neurons? Is that really relevant? Don't they just need to know about things like space learning, interleaved learning, those kind of things, which are psychological ideas? So let's have some puzzles. Let's do some puzzles. Why do I forget what the capital of Hungary is? Not always Hungary, other capitals. Why do I forget that kind of stuff if I haven't thought about it recently? But not that I'm afraid of spiders. Never forget that. Why do I find that I've learned things better after a night's sleep? Let's say I get 7 out of 10 in a test. Why am I delighted with that if I was expecting to get a 5, but demoralized if I was expecting to get a 9? Why, as a teenager, did I start doing risky things to impress my friends, which I hadn't previously? Why is the opinion of my friends all of a sudden so much more important? Why does my mind sometimes go blank when I'm stressed in an exam, when I turn that paper over? Hopefully not when I'm giving an online talk. Why do I learn a new language so much more easily when I'm 5 than when I'm 50? What are the answers to those questions? Well, I said I'd say a little bit more about machine learning. Let's say Google DeepMind. I'll make up that. This is actually a robot created by the Boston Institute. But let's say these guys invented a new learning mechanism with their deep artificial neural networks. You're building a learning robot. We know now enough about how computers that learn, machine learning systems, how they learn, to know that we could design a learning system that doesn't sleep, doesn't have to sleep. Maybe you have to recharge it, but it doesn't need sleep, right? So this idea that somehow you learn better after sleep, that seems unnecessary. We don't have to have sleep in a learning device. And so long as it hasn't broken down, we could design this device so that learning doesn't change with age. It just learns equally well as long as it's working, however old it is. It wouldn't have to develop. We built it. It doesn't have to have an adolescence for it to start doing crazy things. Information on spiders and their related dangers and capital cities of European countries, we could just store those in the same way in a memory system, and we wouldn't have to forget at all. What is forgetting about anyway? So long as my hard drive is working, I don't need to forget any of this stuff. The stuff of learning, you can just have objective performance metrics, right? There's this idea of, I'm really excited if I got a better mark than I thought, but demoralized if I got a worse. You don't have to have those emotions in a learning system. It can just learn to and maximize its performance. So what we know is that many of those puzzling aspects of learning, these are not necessary requirements of any system that has to learn. These are characteristics of the way we happen to learn because we're learning with brains. And the brain is a biological organ that works in the particular way it does because it has an evolutionary history. It's not, it's optimized for if you take a sort of a tree primate brain a couple of million years ago, you can improve that and it'll be better at learning and make it bigger, be more intelligent, and we can have kind of social primates and they can figure out some culture. But we have the constraints of where we came from about how we're going to learn. So for example, the brain has to do thinking and learning with neurons. That may not be the best way to go, but biology uses neurons for central nervous system. And it may be that the cost of doing cognition, thinking, learning with neurons is that you have to sleep. Learning from a neuroscience perspective is about changing the strength of the connections between neurons, but that has to be consolidated. You kind of change them in the moment, but then you need to change the structure permanently to do learning, to consolidate. Also, all that neural activity takes a lot of nutrients, a lot of energy. It's like 20–30% of the body's energy is going into running the brain. You get waste products built up in around the neurons in the brain when you do that. So those are two probable reasons why we need to sleep, that you need to take the brain offline to consolidate learning and also clear away the waste products and replenish energy stores. These aren't necessary components of learning. These are learning as it works in the brain. So this is a general point about why we think if you understand how the brain works, it's going to shed light on learning in ways that are useful for educators. So I'm going to say educational neuroscience still relatively new in terms of a research field, a translational research field, but it's not uncontroversial. There are criticisms about the approach. I'm going to say there are distractions as well, sort of research activities or debates, which I don't think are core to what educational neuroscience is trying to do. So in terms of criticisms, there are some people who just maintain kind of a priori, conceptually, philosophically, that neuroscience is too low level for education, that there is no path from brain scan to lesson plan, as they like to say. And in a sense, it is a challenge to go from the very low levels to think about how a neuron works to how that changes, say, the need for sleep and how sleep is working and what parts of sleep are important, and how much sleep you need and how much sleep you need at different ages, and thinking about how sleep fits into an educational curriculum as some kind of sleep hygiene training that fits into pupils' curricula. Now, that's a kind of multiple levels, and it takes a lot of interaction between researchers to do that. But there are some people who say, can't be done, it's too remote. There are some people who say they just don't like neuroscientists preaching to teachers. It sounds all wrong. Neuroscientists telling teachers how they should be doing their job. I'm going to agree with that. That's not what educational neuroscience is supposed to be. And maybe there are just doubts about, where we're at in neuroscience, say using brain scans to diagnose developmental disorders or so forth. Maybe those tools are just not in a kind of good enough state at the moment. I think that's reasonable criticisms of just where we are at the moment. There are some distractions, which I don't think are that important, but get quite a lot of kind of airtime. The idea of neuromyths, kind of misunderstanding of, we only think with 10% of our brains, if only we could use the other 90%. This for me is about improving science communication. It's not really about educational neuroscience per se. There are some people who think that it's actually a technical term, the seductive allure of neuroscience, of arguing that all you're doing is putting a brain image next to some kind of psychological theory of learning, and that super impresses people, that they're more likely to believe it if it's got a brain image there. Again, that's not about educational neuroscience. That's about technically a contextual framing effect. I think it's kind of good in a sense that the teachers are more likely to believe someone whose instructional technique is backed by an understanding of learning mechanisms. But this idea that somehow neuroscience is just used as sort of salesman technique. I don't think that's part of the enterprise of educational neuroscience. And indeed, there are companies out there who are trying to flog you brain training products and just sort of neuroscience window dressing as proved by scientists. You can't stop that kind of thing happening as a researcher. So remember, everyone, don't be impressed by brain images on their own. They don't tell you anything. We're trying to understand how learning works. Don't believe in neuromyths, and don't waste money on brain training. Okay, none of these are what educational neuroscience is about. Okay, so let's think about what educational neuroscience is. Well, I'd argue that there are kind of two ways that the neuroscience and education can interact. Most of that is going to be indirectly with what you would describe as cognitive neuroscience, our understanding about how the brain works, influencing our psychological theories. So cutting edge research in language development, literacy, numeracy, science, socio-emotional skills, executive functions, special educational needs. There's a big evidence base accumulating about how things work in the brain to deliver these kind of education relevant skills. However, not all of the interaction between neuroscience and education needs to be indirect like that. We can think of the brain as a biological organ, and that biological organ has certain kinds of needs, which don't really have any kind of corresponding version within psychological theories. So the brain works better if the body is aerobically fit. It gets better delivery of oxygen. It works better if it gets the right kind of nutrients. So diet is important. Its response to stress hormones causes certain changes and indeed damage in chronic stress to neurons. So we can think about stress reduction. And as I've already talked a little bit about, sleep is this kind of biological requirement of the brain. So that kind of direct route is thinking about advice or techniques about putting children in the classroom at the beginning of the day in the best condition to benefit from the learning experiences they're going to have. So one of the important things I want to address this idea about is educational neuroscience, the neuroscientists lecturing, wagging their fingers at teachers. And I want to say completely the opposite. Teachers are the expert in the classroom. And for sure, you know, your cognitive neuroscientists may be developing an understanding about how cognitive control and working memory and language and planning, these kind of skills develop in children. But that's completely different from trying to get a class of 36-year-olds into their PE kits, or trying to get them all pay attention to some part of mathematics that's being explained in the class. So that is the realm of the teacher, and at no point is the argument going to be that neuroscientists are telling teachers how to do things in the classroom. And indeed, I was talking to one of my colleagues who spends some of his time volunteering to work in year 6, so kind of 10, 11-year-olds. And I asked him, you spend time in the classroom, how does that interact with, how does that shape your research theories within educational neuroscience? And my colleague, Denis Marichal, he said, you know, it just makes me realize how little of the time in the classroom is really active, engaged learning for the children. How much of it is pragmatics of organizing individuals, of talking to them and getting them to pay attention, of organizing the layout of the classroom, of doing kind of admin tasks, and so forth. But his take from that was that just means if you've only got 10% of engaged learning time for the children, you need to use that 10% in the most effective way you can. And that means that's where the researchers come in, saying, what is the most effective way? What techniques are best for your topics to impart those skills, given the limited active learning time you have for those children? Now, if you're a skeptic, and I'm going to accept some of you out there are, you might say, look, teachers know what works best in the classroom from experience. And the longer the teachers have been in the classroom, the more they are going to learn from experience and know what works for their kids. So this is kind of expertise. And this knowledge is handed down between generations. Teachers have known this stuff for a long time. And maybe just the neuroscientists are coming along and turning this into brain language. So, you know, the teachers know that kids need to be paying attention. Now the neuroscientists are saying, oh, you need to synchronize the oscillations of the frontoparietal attention network. I mean, is that really helpful? That's just adding kind of brain language to what teachers already know. Well, I'm going to say a few things about that, but one of the things, I'm going to use some kind of abstruse analogy here, so apologies for that. But 400 years ago, we knew that if you chew the bark of the cinchona tree, it alleviates the fever, the symptoms of malaria. You know, we knew that 400 years ago. Okay. When kids have malaria, when adults have malaria now, we don't give them bark to chew, right? In between a few hundred years of the development of basic sciences, the natural sciences, of biology, of biochemistry, of pharmacology, of understanding what is the active agent in the tree bark, and are there different drugs that do something similar to that, and what kind of variants of malaria is this going to work for, and is it not going to work for? So now if you go onto the CDC site in the US, you can look at all the range of different treatments there are for malaria, and what to do if someone has allergies to it, or if there's a particular resistant type. There are different variations of drugs that work in a similar way. So the whole point here is that just because something works, and you know, teachers are pretty good at doing their job, right? Just because something works doesn't mean it can't be improved further by understanding how it works. Okay, so that's the main message. It's not a criticism of teachers, it's just taking things that already look like they work, from figuring out why they work, who they work best for, and then trying to improve them by an understanding of mechanism. So this brings us on, we're getting further towards the end now, into the tough stuff. Do we know how the brain works? Well, probably enough to know like how it doesn't work, and the kind of broad kind of principles of function. So, you know, very broadly, it's like a car with the kind of sensory systems in the back, but the motor in the front, right? And the inside of the brain is more bothered about emotions, and the outside of the brain more kind of sensory motor information processing. So we know some of the stuff about that. I've tried to put some of that basic understanding together on a website. If you're interested in that, go to www.howthebrainworks.science. Broadly, for the purposes of this talk, broadly, the brain doesn't work like a desktop computer. Okay, desktop computer, what you're watching this on, or your mobile phone, has a central processing unit and working memory and long-term memory. And it has general purpose processing devices where all the information, the video, the audio, all the programs, how to run Microsoft Word, it's all put into the same abstract format. And then you use general purpose devices, the CPU, to process all the content. So it uses abstraction, general purpose mechanisms, and it works by moving information around really quickly. The more powerful your computer is, the more gigahertz the CPU works at, and probably the bigger the hard drive, the bigger the working memory. Okay, not how the brain works. The brain works basically by having content-specific systems. It basically has one lobe per sensory system in the back of the brain, and then a motor cortex, and then the front of the motor cortex is doing modulation, telling the back of the brain what bits of it should be working at any one time. Inside the brain are emotion systems and sort of episodic memory systems to remember, you know, what is important to you to survive and for your goals, and remember what situations you were in when good things or bad things happen. The key principle for how the brain works is actually in the brain, it's really hard to move knowledge around because it's stuck in the connections between neurons. So that basic constraint of biology means it has to work in a very different way to a desktop computer. So as an example, if I learn about the dogs, the general concept of dogs, I've learned about that by having lots of individual experiences with dogs. There was one I saw yesterday. It was a poodle. There was one I saw the day before. It was an Alsatian. How do I move knowledge from my episodic memory of the dogs I encountered into my conceptual memory, my general concepts of what dogs are? Turns out that that's one of the key roles of sleep. You have to shut the whole brain down. You have to reactivate the episodic memory, your autobiographical memory. It's in something called the hippocampus. Reactivate it and gradually transfer the knowledge out into the cortex of the brain and build your concepts there. And that takes about 3 months, that process. So what happens in microseconds inside a desktop computer, moving information around, takes 3 months in your brain, and you have to take your brain computer offline for 1/3 of the time each day in order to do it. That's just an indication about how differently the brain works. And of course, that has implications for learning. I think one of the main things I would want anyone to take home about how the brain works is that the kind of skills that we're trying to teach children in the classroom, learning, thinking, reasoning about specific topics like maths and science and literacy and these kind of things, these are probably the least important priorities for the brain. Most important priorities for the brain, well, we have a pyramid here. Most important, stay alive, right? Don't overheat, don't get too thirsty, basic what's called homeostasis. Next most important priority is sensory and motor. Use your senses to make the right motor movements at the right times. Next most important are your emotions. Evolution has built structures in the middle of your brain for the goals that are important for you as a Homo sapiens. So running away from scary situations, getting closer to attractive members of the other sex, looking after your kids, things that excite you, scare you. We have emotion systems that are trying to protect you and further your evolutionary goals. We are social primates. A lot of the brain is bothered about dealing with other people. Who's looking at you? How close are you sitting to other people? Do you recognize that person? Are they your friend or your enemy? Where do you sit in the pecking priority in your group? Are you popular? Are you not popular? And so forth. These are all more important priorities to the brain than thinking and learning. Okay. So what is the take home for that? Well, if you want to get that top bit, the thinking and learning in the classroom, you need to align all the other priorities so that they at least don't get in the way, or at best, support the activities of what you're trying to do in the thinking and learning priorities in the classroom. So I'm getting close to wrapping up here. I want to emphasize, we know more about how the brain works, but we shouldn't underestimate the complexity of what's going on. So learning for a teacher is a child comes into the classroom, they do some activities, they go out with new knowledge or new skills, right? From the point of the brain, there are lots of different learning systems. So there's a system for learning concepts, a system for kind of snapshot memories, a system for learning skills like procedures, tying your shoelaces. There's part of the brain that's bothered about making your skills automatic, so you no longer have to pay attention while you're doing them. There's part of your brain that's learning strategies and kind of control when you should be doing what kind of activities. There's part of your brain that's interested in maximizing rewards and avoiding aversive kind of situations. We have conditioning as a part of the brain that you ate something and it makes you sick, like mushrooms. You don't want to eat mushrooms anymore. That's kind of a one-shot learning. It's kind of a basic animal learning system. There's whole parts of your brain that are involved in social processing that you can use to learn from imitation. You just need to be shown some activity and you can copy it and try and improve from that. And then large parts of our brain are involved in understanding the language and enabling us to learn from instruction, to try and activate some kind of motor procedures given some instruction. All of these different systems are going to work together. So, I say it's 8, that's kind of hand wavy. Different neuroscientists would disagree how you count them. But you can think about all these systems interacting with each other, They involve different kinds of brain areas. We basically know that these different systems have different preferences for the rate of learning. For example, you learn concepts slowly, but episodic memory works in one go. We know that for conceptual learning, it's quite good to interleave and mix content. And it's quite good to repeat and practice retrieving, using the frontal part of the brain to retrieve the conceptual knowledge in the back of the brain. But if you want to learn motor skills, don't interleave them, right? You don't want to learn the foxtrot by keep swapping and learning the tango. You'll just get the two of them mixed up. Much better to learn the foxtrot, and once you've learned it, learn how the tango is a little bit different from the foxtrot. That's because it's different kind of brain systems that are involved in learning. So part of our job is for a given topic or skill that you're trying to teach, what is the preferred diet of the brain for learning and consolidating and improving access to that type of knowledge. The brain has this general preference that it doesn't like to work too hard, doesn't like to have to pay attention and concentrate really hard when doing a skill. So through practice, the brain is gradually moving knowledge to different parts, particularly to the cerebellum, particularly to sort of basal ganglia motor loops. Don't need to know about this stuff, but there's always the gradient that the more we practice things, the more it's becoming automatic. The more automatic it is, the less flexible it is. So there's this payoff between doing things easily and fluidly without paying attention, but also doing them inflexibly. And then we also know that learning differs across the ages. The older you are, the more you have the opportunity to acquire new skills and new knowledge by just taking bits of skills you already have and plugging them together, sort of by analogy. I'm learning a new computer game. Someone tells me, it's a bit like Tetris. That's already given me a head start. And then I can use that kind of task schema, that set of procedures, and I can tune them differently for the new situation. I'll just give you a flavor of the kind of how neuroscience principles unfold in different areas of educational skills. So here to give you an example, here's reading. So here's an example in learning to read English. The child has to have letter knowledge to learn that the visual symbols, for the letters, P goes with the per sound, Q goes with the qu sound, B with the b sound, and D with the d sound. What we're doing in reading is taking an already developed visual system and trying to co-opt it to connect visual information with our oral language system. Now that visual system has gone through a developmental pathway where it wants to do particular things for you. In particular, the ventral pathway, this is running along there underneath the temporal lobe, it wants to recognize objects for you in the world. And it wants to recognize them irrespective of their orientation. That's its job, recognize three-dimensional objects. So if you look at that teacup, it's a teacup, whether it's upside down, whether the handle is on the left or the right. And that's how the system is developed to have that kind of, technically it's called a translation invariance. And now you're showing the child these letters, P, Q, B, and D, which actually look like a teacup oriented in different directions. And you're trying to tell the child, each of those visual objects go with a different sound in your language. And quite predictably, the child struggles with rotation invariance and mirror invariance because they've got to unlearn what they previously learned to recognize visual objects. And hence you see these characteristic kinds of errors in children. I hope my son forgives me for showing his maths homework here from some years ago. I'm going to say he got all the sums right, but have a look at that 5 there. It's well formed, but it's just mirror reversed. And the same again over here. So these are just characteristics of the visual system that hasn't unlearned the mirror reversal that's part of the visual object recognition system. Here's an example from mathematics. That's like one topic in the classroom. You're doing maths, right? From the point of view of the brain, it's lots of different things, which all have to be brought together in a common context. So maths is about symbols, but it's also about words. It's about amounts, quantity. These are processed in a different part of the brain, the parietal lobe instead of the temporal lobe for kind of the symbols. and language. Also, we teach counting through use of the body, through use of the fingers. So we're connecting to parts of the body involved in finger manipulation. And then we have facts that have to be automated. 3 times 4 equals 12. You need to store often these in a kind of language format or kind of number bonds. 8 is made up of 6 and 2. And then we need our procedures, our calculation. 25 times 41. Can't do that in your head. You need to learn the steps and how you might interact with a piece of paper to write those out, to carry numbers and so forth. So from the point of view of the brain, maths is all sorts of different skills that will be using different types of learning systems. More broadly, you can think of concepts, like kind of high-level concepts, as using language to integrate multiple different contexts and situations and procedures in the brain. So we have a label 6, and we think we know what 6 means, but actually it's different kind of underlying concepts. There's groups of 6, there's 6 in a number line sitting between 5 and 7. You can split things into 6 components. All of these are different sort of sensory motor realizations that we need to integrate by showing children how they relate to each other and using language as this kind of integrating method. Okay, I don't want to overrun here. Maybe this bit is important for you or not. Maybe I'll just come back to this. The tough question throughout my time working in educational neuroscience, which is over a decade or more, of all of this neuroscience stuff, what do teachers need to know? And I'm going to say it's not things like how brain scanners work, and it's not things like, oh, these are the different brain areas that light up doing a different task. Instead, it's some basic principles that influence how we understand learning. So I've already alluded to the first one. In the classroom, learning and thinking is built on our sensory and motor systems. What happens in our heads has its origins in our bodies. Emotions are an integral part of every thought and action. Harnessing them is the cornerstone for effective learning. Our brains are really bothered about other people, including teachers and including the peer group. And that can be used for the benefit of, say, peer learning, but it can also have the detriment of girls not wanting to put up their hands in science classes, or naughty kids talking in the back row to impress their mates. We know that thinking is hard. It's not an easy part that the brain goes to readily to learn education relevant skills. The brain has evolved for processing senses and coordinating movements. Abstract thinking is a really different culturally invented thing that the brain doesn't take to readily. Learning, even harder than thinking. In a sense, the brain can't help but learn. It's always adapting to the situations. It's what it does. But we're talking about a special sort of learning in an educational context that goes on in classrooms. And that is a really complicated thing for the brain to do. And it takes a long time and it takes a lot of repetition. How are we going to use that knowledge in the classroom? Some of the answers are going to be general about skills like attention, a working memory, emotions and motivations and so forth. Some of them are going to be specific to topics like particular aspects of learning to read, of mathematics, of arts, of sciences, of learning about sports and group games and so forth. And of course, where I started this talk was to think about educational neuroscience in its wider context. It's not all about brains. It's also about students, about teachers, about classroom environments, about schools, about communities, and about societies. So you may have turned up and said, what are Michael Thomas's top tips for teachers that I can try out on Monday? And I'm not really into tips. And the reason for that is I think that they're kind of disempowering, because no technique works for all children in all contexts. And if I give you a tip and it doesn't work, you'll think, oh, this educational neuroscience stuff doesn't really work, does it? Instead, if you understand why a technique works, then you'll understand how and when to use it, how it can be adapted, what bits of it can be modified for the context of your children, but which are essential and which you shouldn't mess with. Hey, that said, here are some tips. See, I'm flexible. General principle, take this home. Thinking and learning are not the brain's highest priorities. You need to align the more important brain priorities to learning for your best outcomes. There are the priorities: sensory motor top, emotion second, social third, then your memory and cognitive skills lowest down here. Tips for sensory motor: embody your learning, deal with the distractions, harness attention, be explicit whether children should focus, use concrete examples to help build abstract ideas. Emotions: harness motivation, make emotional connections, use feedback, reward, strategize to encourage active learning, promote self-efficacy, avoid negative and distracting emotions. Social: observe others, teach others, because teaching other people is a form of learning yourself. Learn from other people's mistakes and viewpoints. Create classrooms that are error-tolerant environments. And lastly, in memory, use multiple pathways, say it, show it, use case studies and analogies, work with existing knowledge, elaborate, retrieve, test, space out, and interleave learning. There you go, there are your tips. Want to know more? I do have a forthcoming book. It's taken a long time to think about how you go from neuroscience to information that's useful for teachers. And we have written a book that we hope will be useful. That is coming out in October. Coming next week, you'll get a really worked out detailed case study from Andy, which goes from classroom challenges through the neuroscience to actually a learning activity and evaluating that. So I want to acknowledge all my funders. Thank you for your attention. And now it's time for questions. Thanks very much, everyone. All right, I am stopping sharing.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think it was a very insightful presentation that I think it's, made me think a lot about teachers' practices and what we can learn from what teachers are actually doing in classrooms, and try to, pick up on things that might not be working and then rethink the practices. I'm not sure whether there are any questions in the chat. Maybe you can take a couple of questions. If not, I think Erica has some questions prepared for you, which you might wish to, attempt to answer.
Questions, Michael.
Yes. To answer Marie-Thérèse, yes, the next webinar is next Wednesday, 18th. It's at 2 p.m., 2 to 4 p.m. It seems that Marie-Thérèse has...
advertising it, right, James?
Pardon?
We're going to continue advertising it now.
Yes, definitely. Yes. I think Marie-Thérèse has a question. You can come in, Marie-Thérèse. Thank you.
Yes, actually, I have two questions, but I'll start with one in case, and then ask my second one later.
Great.
It's become very common in education, especially in early childhood, to diagnose children with conditions, and at the age of 5 we're already saying they can't do maths or they have problems with literacy, and we send them for complementary lessons, we withdraw them from the class, and it's already an issue at the age of 5. And seeing hearing your explanations about the different workings of the brain and different parts of the brain work on different things. I wonder sort of what, you might, as a general kind of guideline from the perspective of neuroeducation, what you can advise to make sure that we are not over-diagnosing, at too early an age. So if we can make a link between neuroeducation and this, I feel it's almost an obsession, to measure and label children at a very young age.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So one of the activities that I didn't talk about for the Center for Educational Neuroscience is some new work we're doing at the moment to try and look at the basic research in cognitive neuroscience and its relevance for special educational needs. So if you're interested, I'm going to put something in the chat. For you to Google. Yeah, Google that, and hopefully you'll pull up our project where we have been. I think there's a huge amount of work to be done here. So there is a very big evidence base over 20 or 30 years of trying to understand different neurodevelopmental conditions and what the causes of them are, the extent to which they're heritable, the extent to which there are different kind of subgroups, looking at conditions like autistic spectrum condition, ADHD, looking at developmental language disorder, a range of different conditions of this sense, a lot of basic research. And it's not clear that how much of that is effectively translated into a way that's useful for teachers. So we have been trying to do some work around that. Our initial scoping work was to have a big survey of teachers about what do you know about the brain and special educational needs. And we found some myths out there and some accurate understanding. And we were trying to have a look at how much of that depended on the teacher's level of experience. Right? How much have they worked with children with these needs, and what was their understanding? And we published a paper last year on that. And our second step was to have some kind of awareness campaigns, and we have some short explainer videos on different neurodevelopmental conditions, which are targeted at teachers to help their understanding about that. So part of that is there's work to be done in the area. I'm also aware that you get into this real kind of tension between the theoretical understanding and different kind of practical areas, either for the position of the teachers and the children or the parents. So for example, from a theoretical point of view, much of the research is telling us that there are not specific conditions, there are not specific categories, that many of the strengths and weaknesses of the children lie on a spectrum, and also that even though researchers have often investigated individual disorders, so like let's say attention disorders, there's a recognition that comorbidity, a child having multiple kind of weaknesses is more common than having a very narrow kind of disorder. So a child who has dyslexia is more likely to have ADHD or dyscalculia as well. So we're understanding from a theoretical point of view that there's no real cutoff when you do or don't have a disorder. We're also understanding that patterns change across development. We find that some children, so if you diagnose very early, if you look at like 3 to 4 year olds and you say, let's ask the parents whether they're worried about the child's language development. Is that the child, are they behind their peers? Do you have concerns that the child is delayed? That's kind of early, maybe it's good to intervene early, let's diagnose early, that kind of thing. If you follow those children later on, come back to them, say when they're 6 years of age, about 2/3 of those children are now scoring in the normal range on language tests, right? And that's because development happens at different rates. Some of those children just take longer to get going, right? But 1/3 of them will have persistent deficits that require some kind of speech and language therapy support. So that is telling we're understanding more about this, but then from the parent's point of view, in many educational systems, you need a specific diagnosis in order to access resources to help your child. So from the parent's point of view, they want a diagnosis, they want a label because it enables them to help their child. From the teachers and the child's point of view, there is the downside of labeling. We understand that labeling can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it causes self-esteem problems in the children and so forth. So we have these many different constraints, and we're trying to think about the best way to take this forward. Some work we have planned is to do a systematic review of the evidence of what kind of techniques seem to work best with children with different special educational needs. And there is a question about whether there would be an SEN pedagogy. Is there a special way to teach children with a given disorder, say more a social disorder like autism versus an attentional disorder? Or really, does this all just fall under individualization? You just need to teach to the child in front of you. Should you not be putting them in categories and be worrying about diagnoses anyway? So I think all of these, this is a rich area where we can make progress on this, but we have to understand the different constraints of the different parties involved. How's that? What, you had a second question as well, right?
Yes, no, but I'll wait. Maybe others would like to ask something.
Sure.
Marie-Thérèse,
I think you can go ahead with your second question, because I don't have any other questions here.
I just would appreciate a bit more elaboration on one of your very, very early slides. It's like I wanted to have a look at it, but then obviously you moved on in the talk. Perhaps we could go back to it and you could just explain, you know, we could have a look at how to read the graph exactly. It was, I think, the 5th slide or very early on. It was a graph where you had it's worth it or not worth it. And
yeah, I'll do better than that. I will, because that was a little graph. Let me see if I can make it big for you.
And I just needed like more explanation or more time perhaps to understand exactly what was worth it or not worth it and why things were placed where they were placed on the graph. Yes, that one. If you could just talk me through it a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. So this is an outcome. It's a few years old now and probably has been updated. It's a summary of all the randomized control trials, the evidence-based put together by the Education Endowment Foundation. So the idea is that each of these blue squares is the outcome of one or more randomized control trials where they have used a technique typically against a business as usual control condition. So here's how we're normally doing teaching. Let's try something else. Let's try one-to-one tuition, okay, in large samples and matched. And we will see on some, so these are educational outcomes. So end of year tests, standardized tests. What is the improvement in how well that child has done, or the children in the one-to-one tuition condition have done? Now, statistically, we have different ways of quantifying how big the effects are. But the way that the Education Endowment Foundation does it is to try and quantify in months of progress that children would typically make in whatever it is, maths or literacy and so forth. At the same time, the Education Endowment Foundation is asking those researchers, please quantify how much it would cost in order to bring in that technique, okay? Because we do know that the policymakers, that the government has a finite amount of money, and you may get a huge increase in educational outcomes if you double the number of teachers in schools or something, or give them all fancy computers and so forth. But these are very expensive ways to shift outcomes. From the point of view of a policymaker, your ideal is something that has a big effect, which doesn't cost much per pupil. So what you've got here is a summary graph that is trying to pull together by plotting each intervention, what is the cost per pupil, or from 0 up to £1,000, and how big is the effect on outcome. So you might have something like performance pay for teachers, something that teachers unions, they might kind of debate, is that going to improve outcomes if you really incentivize the best teachers by results? Do you then, how much does it cost? It's going to cost about £300 per pupil to incentivize the teachers, bigger pay rises. How big an effect size does that have on the pupils' outcomes? Very little. Okay. On the other hand, metacognitive strategies, telling the kids something about how their mind works and what kind of skills to use when they're doing tests, or that kind of giving children not just basic skills, but understanding of their own learning. That has a big effect size and doesn't cost much per pupil. So Education Endowment Foundation, it is not there to produce policy. It's there to produce evidence base. So they produce these kind of summary graphs, or the kind of toolkit that has more detail in it, to offer to policymakers to make their decisions about, depending on the kind of education budget available. I think my reservation on this kind of summary is that it suggests that a technique will always have the same effect for everyone. Whereas I think a lot of what we find with different techniques is that they work differently for different children, depending on those children's ability, depending on their prior knowledge, depending on the kind of cultural context, the family background, and so forth. And I'm going to say as well that if you think back to the kind of nested constraints, we know that the effect of the school on children's cognitive abilities is about the third of the size of the effect of differences in the family environment. So we know that this kind of stuff is only targeting some of the variation, and there's a lot of stuff of trying to work with parents. So, I mean, parental involvement is in there, but kids from poor families are going to do worse, and giving them just stuff during the school day on its own is not going to alleviate all of that gap. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much. Yep.
All right. Okay.
Erica, maybe you can choose a question.
Okay, so I've got 3. Shall I choose one, or shall I go for all? James?
Well, we have at least half an hour, so.
Okay, I'll go for 3 because the 3 are interesting. So, Michael, having researched this innovative area, why, in your opinion, is the science of learning so crucial?
Well, there are different kinds of answers to that, and they operate over different time frames. So the current situation is a risk that there are fads in education, and that we swing between using different methods, and there's no consistency, and as a consequence, we make no progress. We're not in a gradual accumulation of knowledge of what works, and that's a limit to our progress. And fundamentally, it is really hard to work out what works for children because there are so many factors going on. And that's why you need some kind of systematic evaluation of what works in the classroom. We all know it, that if we get an idea into our head that something is working in our own classroom for our own pupils, we tend to then look for confirmatory evidence that supports that. And we can kid ourselves. We can all kid ourselves about our understanding of what works. So this is the idea. The learning science is about building an evidence base that will allow us to begin to accumulate knowledge that will mean we can progress, okay, rather than just swing between different types of approaches. I've indicated a little bit with my spiel on my reservation about tips is, tips I think are disempowering if you don't understand how they work and why they work and who they work for. And the learning sciences is trying to give teachers a better understanding, a better feel for why methods work and when they work. And particularly this will support personalization, teaching to the individual child rather than using general approaches, which may work for some and not for others. So the immediate term thing is to try and change the environment, the narrative, so we can accumulate and make progress. Part of it is sort of more intermediate, building a larger evidence base. I think the longer range view is part of the professionalization of teaching. And I'm going to use an imperfect analogy here to your general practitioner, your local doctor, and how they operate, and trying to think of an analogy between the doctor and your classroom teacher. So the doctor, they see patients every day, right? That's a social thing. They're interacting with the person and trying to get a sense. They ask questions, they look for symptoms, say how you're feeling, what's going on in your life. It's a personal relationship, right? But that doctor has a medical training about how the body works. Okay, they understand something about mechanism. They don't just have a rule book that says, given this symptom, give that drug. They understand more about the mechanism, and that helps them inform their diagnosis and how to work with that person. Whether that person's just a bit depressed, they just need a chat. Whether they're depressed irrespective of life events, they may need some medication, and so on and so forth. So they have a science training, but who's around them? They have like nurses. The nurses also have some science training about how the body works. They are like practitioners, they're more kind of practical, they do injections and so forth. But they're not just figuring this out as they go along because someone told them, here's how to do an injection, right? You're ready to go practice on some people. So the idea is somehow that the teacher should be more like that, should get that. We know that education is the most powerful cognitive enhancer there is out there to improve IQ. Education is how you do it. So in the words of Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Teachers should be understanding the system that they're messing with in the same way that doctors understand how bodies work, right? And we have classroom assistants, which are the equivalent of nurse. They need to understand less, but not just you're there to transport kids around and help them read, but they should understand a little more about that. And then where are doctors getting those treatments from? Where are they getting the new medicines from? There's a huge research and development industry doing basic research, which is saying to the doctor, hey, this is the latest theory about what might work for that kind of condition and so forth. The doctors aren't sitting there saying, who are these patronizing scientists telling me how to do my job? No, they're just viewing it as that those are researchers who are supporting my practice and offering me new tools, right? So that would be the sense about the relationship between basic research and the evidence base, and how the empowered teacher, who's still in charge of the classroom, and the classroom assistants are trying to work to get best educational outcome for their teachers. Now, this is not an amazing analogy because public health is different to education, right? Public health is normative. We know there's healthy, there's unhealthy. We want to get from unhealthy to healthy, right? And education is different from that. So we don't definitely, there's no definite answer about what we're going to teach our kids. That is a society debate for what kind of skills we want our teachers, our pupils to have. How do we balance the importance of assessing how they're doing, kind of formative assessment against the amount of stress that causes them? How do we prepare children for the stressful environment of the workplace, in school? What is our balance between, the stress of pushing kids versus you want them to perform? But all of these are kind of general questions that we have to decide as a society. So we can't quite have that kind of analogy, but you can see that a long term in the future, you could have a different vision of teachers who are more similar in their level of expertise and professionalism to the kind of medical model you see with a general practitioner. How's that? That's question
Michael.
one, right?
I think we have Roberta Mifsud who wants to ask a question.
Great, thanks, Roberta.
Hello, a very interesting presentation, and one slide I really liked was that slide where you're saying there is an interplay between at least 8 different systems. Basically, I come from a school where our students have tried their O-level exams in previous years, and they didn't succeed and come to our school. And basically, we have to do a 3-year syllabus squashed into one scholastic year.
Mhm.
So basically what interested me very much in there is the rate of learning, consolidation, and forgetting for each system. Can you refer to some literature which I can read through, learning a bit more about this thing, the different kinds of, the different systems of the brain, the rates, and even this could be useful as I see it. If I'm teaching something, is it better if I teach it through observation? Is it better if I teach it through emotional episodes? Is there some literature which I can refer to and understand, which can help, please?
Yeah, so there will be in October. So we have our book coming out. You can look at our How the Brain Works website, but I think that's not yet in the ideal form. So our forthcoming book, we have tried to make those kinds of translations. I appreciate your challenge. I think it's a tough one, a very interesting one. We do know that you can get big gains by throwing the kitchen sink, throwing everything at children. Now, part of that is the types of learning experiences that you make them have. And I think one of your challenges with compressing 3 years into one is that there is kind of a rate limiter to learning. It kind of maxes out the amount of learning you can get. So you can't just carry out doing more and more and more. And that is the idea behind space learning rather than mass learning, and the importance of sleep to consolidate knowledge, and the importance of interleaving, so doing things in the right order, so having some interleave learning of content, doing that in a social environment so everyone's feeling positive about it, using kind of peer-based learning, and then these various techniques to help children retrieve that learning in the right context. So what retrieval practice, so getting them to talk about, to produce, discuss the kind of information that they're learning is an important way to maximize its accessibility. I'm going to say the biggest effects are, so I think I'm going to step back just for a moment and say in the early days of educational neuroscience, there was a hope that we would find some magic bullet, some revolution, that if you just did X thing with kids, you would get amazing improvements. And there have been lots of suggestions about what that may be, from, oh yeah, all kids have to play chess, or you've got to get them all to meditate, or learn a musical instrument, or these kind of things that are like a wonder cure. And the answer is probably most of these things have an effect, but the picture about the best outcome for children is an accumulation of small effects. It's not one big effect. So thinking more holistically about the child, having a child-centered approach where you are bothered about things about their diet, that they're getting enough sleep, that they're getting a relaxed and supportive environment in the household, that the parents are supporting the teachers' expectations of the children, that the children don't have a problem with their basic sensory and motor skills, that they can recognize all the numbers and know some basic procedures, and so that's not getting in the way. And then opportunities to give them intense, motivated, supported learning situations, and have like peer group support for that, and then monitor how they're progressing in a personalized way that can target the thing that child is struggling with. So I could go on for a long time just making the point that it's going to be lots of small additions to get a big bang, a big kind of outcome. But I am aware of there's a company in the UK called Performance Learning, and they actually so they're a private company, and they target secondary school pupils who are falling behind, so vulnerable pupils from kind of poor backgrounds, and they go in and yeah, they're going to charge the school, and they say to the school, we're going to get whatever you're predicting, whatever grade you're predicting for your kids right now, we're going to make sure that they get 2 grades better than that, or we're going to do it for free. So they're pretty confident that they can get those gains, and they do it by attending to all areas of the child's education, including getting the teachers on board, getting the parents on board. They actually, the guy who runs it is a former professional tennis player who makes the children think they're elite athletes. And he brings some celeb friends in to make the kids feel special. And he checks their basic skills, and they have lots of online learning, and which is being monitored and fed back to them, and so on and so forth. So lots of things feed into that, and really impressive outcomes. As I alluded to early on in my talk, if it works with those kids, it's really hard to know why it works. And it may be different things with different kids. So we know if you attend in a child-centered approach, you can get very impressive outcomes. As an educational neuroscientist, those kind of trials are a struggle for me, because I'm trying to think, well, what was the most important bit? How can we scale that up? Is there a way we can do that in a cheaper and more general way? For that, we need to understand how those techniques work.
But at least it exists, this thing that he promises the grades and he achieves them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to say as well that the improvements you get a little bit asymmetric. So if kids who are struggling, often for kind of social reasons, you can get big effects. If kids are already doing well, it's quite hard to accelerate them on with the same techniques. So if you think of the kind of bell curve distribution about how kids are doing, the kind of techniques often work a little bit differently or asymmetrically on the 2 different tails of the distribution.
All right. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Erica, maybe we take one final question and we conclude. What do you think?
Okay. So my next question is, should initial teacher training programs, school development planners, and national policymakers adopt education neuroscience as the foundation for teaching and learning?
Yes, so a short answer to that one. But bear in mind,
I like your answer, Michael.
This is just the child-centered bit, right? And we have to think about that in the context of the school environment, the social environment, the policy environment, and it's part of a wider evidence-based approach. And I would not say that educational neuroscience can tackle some of these bigger issues. And I'll give one example of an issue where it's for society to decide. So, are we interested in the average performance of our population of children, or are we interested in the gaps between them? So if you look at the PISA league tables, where we compare different countries and how well they're doing on, say, maths or reading and so forth, that is comparing the absolute performance of populations. And a minister may say, we want to bring our country up in the ratings, higher in the league tables. And you do that by moving the mean performance of your population. And that's not too hard to do. You just have to spend more time, say, on your maths in the syllabus. Something else, will have less physical exercise. Their reading won't be so good, or something, a drama might not be so good. But you can move whole population distributions by spending more time, by investing in them. Alternatively, you may say, as a government, we really don't like that there are different opportunities for different kids. We're bothered about the gaps between kids, how kids are held back from poor backgrounds. We want to narrow the gaps between kids. And we want to target our investment to close those gaps, to understand the causes about when they emerge and how we can best close them. That may involve a whole different set of techniques, right? And in fact, it may be harder to do than moving the population, because some of those differences, about half of them, look like they're genetic in origin, right? All educational neuroscience can do is say that a society or policymakers, once you've decided what educational outcomes you want, what skills you want your kids to have, how you want the next cohort of children to perform, we can tell you how we think the best way to do that is. Okay, so we have to understand educational neuroscience in its broader context.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think we can end this webinar here. I think you've raised a lot of questions, and I think this will set us thinking about how we can, support teachers and educators in understanding education neuroscience and applying it in their everyday practice. But this is a long-term thing, and we're looking forward to our next week's webinar with Andrew, who will be speaking about, sorry, Marie-Thérèse, do you have anything?
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you, James. Before the end, I was going to ask Professor Thomas if you could repeat the name of the organization that he mentioned just a few minutes ago, where they promised to raise the grades, and just to be able to look it up on the internet.
Yeah, performance learning, I think it is. I'll see if I can find the link to you as well.
You just give me the name, I can Google it.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Okay.
If you pull up their website first, then yeah, you stick it in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, James.
No worries, Marie. No worries, Marie-Thérèse. So we invite you for next week's session with Andrew. The session will be at 2 p.m. Malta time, 2 to 4 p.m. We'll obviously put this on Facebook and send this to educators in Malta. Hopefully, the time will be more adequate for teachers to join. But we've recorded the session, so we'll be sending the recording to the 110 registrants that we've had for this session. Thanks again, Michael, Erica, Michelle, and all those who attended and participated in this discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Good afternoon.
Bye and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.